and then expose it to the air, and that causes a cascade of events to happen here as well. Eventually, they all lead to this step here, where prothrombin is converted to thrombin, and then thrombin is an enzyme which slices up this other protein that's floating around the blood called fibrinogen, and the fibrinogen is converted to fibrin, which makes these long, sticky fibers. The sticky fibers form the clot, or initiate the clot. So it's a fairly complicated pathway. Now, what did the intelligent design creationists say about this? Let's go to the next slide. They like to say that this is evidence that could never have evolved. And why is that? Well, they talk about this thing called irreducible complexity. They say there are some things that are so complicated they could not possibly evolve because there's no way to arrive at the final arrangement from an initial organization. So here I'm going to reduce this a little bit. On that previous slide, got all those proteins and the cascades. I'm just going to use a little cartoon here and say, okay, well, we've got a pathway that's got 4 steps in it. Just 4. We're going to go from A to B to C to D. B is the one we're interested in. It's going to do something in the cell. A is the initiating step. So each of these need a gene product to initiate a change to activate the next step in the pathway. Well, go to the next slide. This is Michael Behe's argument. He says this could not have evolved. Because what must have happened first is that we must have first evolved A to B. And remember, what we want out of this pathway is we want D. D is going to do something useful for the cell. If we just evolve A to B, that goes nowhere. That does nothing. So why would you then evolve C and then finally D? It's like this is something that anticipates evolution. It says, well, we're eventually going to get these things, and then it'll work, which is not the way evolution works. Next slide. So what he's saying is there's a sequential evolution from there to as far as the C step, and then the next slide, we get the D step. One of the problems with Mike Behe's thinking is this is not how evolution works. He's not thinking like a biologist. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so he's saying, how can I get to that step? Because the A to B step alone doesn't do anything. You need D. That's G1. Next slide. Okay, so this is Mike Behe's own words. It says, biochemical pathways are irreducibly complex and impossible to evolve. And his test is if a part is missing, the system won't work at all. So my little diagram of A to D, if you yank out B, you destroy B, the whole thing would fall apart and wouldn't work at all. And if that's the case, then it could not have evolved. Because there must have been some stage in evolution when it was missing. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to give you 3 explanations for irreducible complexity. Why irreducible complexity is a bogus argument against evolution. The first one that I'll go over, I hope fairly quickly, although it's going to be a lot of slides, is scaffolding. That intermediate sets have a redundant function to support the pathway. One classic example of this is building an arch. You know how an arch is. It's got a keystone up here, and the whole thing will stand on its own unless you pull up the keystone and it falls apart. An arch is irreducibly complex. So you might say to yourself, well then, how could arches ever be built? Hey, it must be magic. But you know what the answer is that when the architects are building, then what they have is they have a scaffold, they have set a framework, a wooden framework there that holds everything up until they get the keystone in, and they remove the wooden framework, and it stands on its own. It's the same with the evolution of these pathways. The other one is coevolution. Pathway evolved under conditions that favored alternative steps that were less stringent than what you find in modern organisms. And finally, exaptation. The different parts of the pathway evolved for some other function than D, and they were brought together to make the final pathway. So next slide. Okay, here's our pathway, A to B to C to D. Next slide. Why don't we imagine this was the earlier pathway? Not like B's imaginary A to B. B's the functional one. That was there for a long time. So say you've got a pathway that looks like this, A to B to D. There's no C there. This is the ancestral state, one of the ancestral states. Next slide. What you will often find in these pathways is that they are autocatalytic. What does that mean? That means that if A switches on B, B also has functions that allow B to switch on B. So this is a feed-forward mechanism that makes these reactions go fairly quickly. And it's really, really common to find these things. So inside cells, we're going to find things like phosphate being stuck on proteins to activate them. And they'll be stuck on proteins that stay phosphates on other proteins, and so you get this acceleration. You look at digestive enzymes. They do the same thing. They produce proenzymes that are inert, they're secreted, and then they're cut by an enzyme, and then that enzyme will cut itself, and it can also promote the production of the active enzyme. So there's lots of things that happen like this. This is really common. Next. Another thing that's really common in genetics is duplication. This is easy to have happen too. There's just an error in the reproduction of the DNA, and it makes an extra copy of the gene. Having an extra copy doesn't hurt, usually. There's some cases where it does change doses for some detectable effect, but often it just means you got an extra copy floating around this enzyme. It's a backup, it doesn't do anything much. It can be lost, it can sit there and take function away. So what will happen is that you will have two B genes, two B gene products made in a cell. And what will happen now is when the reaction is initiated by A, it will turn on B, which turns itself on, which also turns on the other copy of B, which turns on A, and you get a greater acceleration of the reaction. And then both of those will work together to turn on B. Again, because it's autocatalytic, those type of reactions happen, and this is also common. We're finding now, when we're looking at the human genome, that one very common thing is something called copy number variants. They're much harder to detect in the past, but we're starting to see them more and more. They're a powerful tool to modify the behavior of the genome. Next. Okay. Now, because there are two versions of B, and you only need one to trigger D, you can have changes. These two genes can now mutate. And they can change in interesting ways. One not so interesting way they can change is that you can have an entirely white one out. Then you just got a dead gene sitting there. But the organism doesn't care because it's got two copies in it. But you can also get subtle changes that change the behavior of these two proteins now. The next slide. So for instance, the original B might require a mutation that doesn't destroy the protein, but makes it so that it's unable to turn on D. So it loses that part of its pathway. This animal is not harmed, however. It's perfectly functional because it's got the second copy, right? It fills in for it, and can do the job of activating D. Next slide. We can have all kinds of changes. So for instance, maybe this B prime is going to change so much that if a molecular biologist sequences it, pulls it out of the organism, puts it in a test tube, and looks at it and says, well, this is a different protein. It's different enough. I can give it a different name to do credit for it. So we can call the protein C at this point. But it's just a mutated version of the ancestral B. And we can have other changes, like maybe A loses its ability to activate C. And what you're getting now is a pathway that looks like this. It's a 4-step pathway instead of a 3-step pathway. It has become more complicated. Next slide. So each protein is becoming more specialized. This is equivalent to, in the next slide, again, this is equivalent to this. So this is how you can take a 3-step pathway, evolve a 4-step pathway. And now at this point, this is irreducibly complex. If there's a mutation that destroys C, for instance, you don't get D anymore, right? So it's irreducibly complex, but obviously that doesn't mean that it could not be evolved. So irreducible complexity is kind of a red herring here to fool you into thinking that this could not be evolved. It says absolutely nothing about the formation of the pathway. Next slide. Okay. Now, that's all hypothetical. Saying, well, here's a possible speculative explanation for how this could have happened. The test in biology is that we use this model to make predictions. And we can make some predictions that if that's always how things work, we expect there's elements in the pathway which show homology going on. That is, if C is actually a duplicate of an